FYI, because this is Teams, you've probably all had this experience yourself. If you're presenting, all I can see is my slides. I can't see anybody. So if anyone's sort of waving to try and get my attention, or if anything goes wrong, please speak up, because I'll hear you, but I won't see you. It's a bit of a strange feeling. But yeah, just to kick off then. So I'll briefly talk about more generally the work of Marine Conservation Society. Obviously, some of you, I would expect, probably are aware of us. Some of you might just have heard bits of our work on the news and things like that. So I'll give a bit of an overview and I'll talk about current projects. This talk is all sort of structured in a way that's hopefully useful in terms of there are various actions on different scales that you might be able to take. So yeah, they could be citizen science projects, they could be, if you've only got 5 minutes, signing a petition or something like that could be really helpful as well. So I'll go through each of those, and then at the end, I'll summarise them. And I've also shared just that summary with hyperlinks to all the relevant places with folks, so that hopefully you can see those afterwards as well if you want to. So yeah, no worries about trying to write things down as I go or anything. So bit of an introduction then. As I say, my role is focused entirely on Scotland. So I think I'll mainly just talk about Scotland in this talk, although various other things are relevant everywhere. So within the Marine Conservation Society, this is our mission. So as a charity, we are the UK's leading charity that looks after our seas and the wildlife in them. I won't read this out to you. There's a few things more cringy than someone just reading from a slide. But just to give you an overview of the sorts of things that we do. So we work at different levels. We definitely work to influence political change. We also work with businesses and industry. And we also work a lot with communities, individuals, volunteers. So we kind of work at those various different levels. And this is our vision. So very much looking at the value of the sea for people and for nature and connecting those. So this may seem like a strange question, especially to lots of you diving folk, but what is so special about the seas around Scotland? Lots of things. It won't be a surprise to any of you to know that this photo is taken in Scottish waters. In fact, this is in the Isle of Arran, just off the Isle of Arran in the protected area there. So you'll probably recognise, some of you might have dived those sites. But for a lot of people who I might show this slide to, they're actually really surprised to discover that we have such colourful marine life in Scotland, and you probably have the same experience when you're talking to pals who aren't divers. But some statistics just to back all that up. So Scotland has 10% of Europe's coastline, which is pretty baffling, but I think it's because we've got such a wiggly coastline and so many islands. And Scotland, from a kind of from a political governance perspective, is important because Scotland looks after 61% of the UK's waters. So again, if you're thinking about marine protection, really it's very important that we work with the Scottish Government to protect our waters here, as well as Westminster. And Scotland has about 800 islands. I quite like the reason that it's about 800 is because apparently folk can't quite agree on the definition of when is it a rock and when is it an island, but we've got a lot of islands, and for you lot, you'll all know that means that's a lot of habitat essentially, and you'll be more familiar than many about how diverse our habitats are in our seas around Scotland. So just a very, very quick trot through some of the particularly important species that live here. These are very much the kind of charismatic species, but everyone I'm sure knows that these are of course Atlantic puffins. But what you may be less familiar with is the fact that Atlantic puffins are vulnerable to global extinction. So this is the IUCN Red List global measure of how threatened an animal is. And the reasons for that are varied. They encompass climate change, damaging fishing practices that have unfortunately really kind of shifted the availability, or in some cases entirely removed the availability of sand eels, which is their primary food source when they're feeding chicks. But often the reasons, the threats are quite interlinked and complex. Leatherback turtles, I hope some of you have been lucky enough to encounter these. So of course every summer this turtle, the largest turtle in the world, they'll visit Scottish waters, and they're here primarily to eat jellyfish because we have such an abundance of jellyfish. Also vulnerable to global extinction. So I do quite a lot of work with schools. We, as a charity, really emphasise the importance of working with young people and educating young people in what we call ocean literacy. So this is all about really sharing our knowledge and passion for the sea and helping to embed an understanding of the sea into all teaching at schools. In schools, we do find, even today, when teachers, if they're talking about climate change, for example, they'll emphasise talking about forests. It's very land-based, where in fact we know the seas are playing an even bigger role. So that's just one example of one of the important messages that we're attempting to really emphasise and amplify. Leatherback turtles are threatened for various reasons, but plastic pollution is a big problem for this species, and that's because they struggle to identify the difference between a plastic bag and jellyfish. And of course we have basking sharks. Again, you might well be very, very knowledgeable on this, but in case anybody isn't aware, one of the things I think that's fascinating about basking sharks is Scotland appears to be potentially the most important place in the world for basking sharks, specifically that quite targeted area off the west coast of Scotland around the small isles, around Egg and Rum and Muck. And this has only been discovered in the last decade or so. Again, it's using tracking technology, these miniaturized computers attached to the sharks, because we still have some very kind of basic questions about these animals to answer, questions around their breeding biology, for example. But with the information we do have, a marine protected area now exists for basking sharks in that area. So that's definitely a positive step, but we need to learn a lot more about basking sharks. The reasons are well known as to why this species is threatened, but unfortunately it was due to overfishing during the last century. Also vulnerable to extinction. So whilst the fishing has stopped quite a while ago, this is an example of, a huge species, very slow life processes. It takes a long time for them to reach maturity. They only give birth to one youngster, one shark at a time. So it takes a long time for a population to grow again, even when the main pressure has been alleviated. And obviously there are other pressures they face as well. So that was just a bit of a canter through, but hopefully there was something interesting in there for you that maybe you didn't know before. So the work of Marine Conservation Society is split into three main areas. The first is called ocean recovery, and that's everything to do with the science, so we can better understand what's living in our seas and how to protect it, why it's threatened. And that's one of the ways in which I'll invite you to get involved later on. All the way through to our policy work, kind of working with governments to bring about better protection for species and habitats. Second big strand of work is called Clean Seas. So as you can expect, that's all about pollution, whether that's visible pollutants like plastics, like the ones you can see on the screen here, or whether that's invisible pollutants like PFAS or things that you might have heard about and read about, chemicals in the water. And we also have a strand of work and a team of scientists working on responsible seafood. So this is all about sustainability. And just to kind of explain the context where I fit into this. So as a charity, we're quite small. In Scotland, there are officially only 3 of us. A few other folk work from the Scottish office, just because Scotland's obviously a great place to be based. But I work alongside 2 policy officers. Those guys are in Holyrood quite a bit, obviously influencing Scottish policy about things like pollution, marine protected areas. And then my role is all the kind of outreach, working with volunteers, communities, and also delivering education and citizen science. So this slide is just to give a wee bit of an overview of what that looks like in normal times. Unfortunately, the top right is probably what it's been looking like more recently. Lots of things like this. But I very much hope that with lockdown lifting, it will change and I'll be back out in schools and on beaches more. Just to reiterate what we said at the start, if people have questions, please just do type them into the chat. We'll come to the questions at the end. I'm more than happy to attempt to answer as many as I can. So just to mention that the volunteers that we have at the Marine Conservation Society are called Sea Champions. Sea Champions can do all kinds of different things, and I won't read through these, I'll just show you these statistics, but just to really highlight that as a charity, we don't have that many staff. We're a relatively small charity, we've got about 60 staff, and so we really couldn't achieve half of what we do without the support of volunteers. Volunteers really are the kind of lifeblood of Marine Conservation Society. Okay, so focusing in on one of those strands of work I mentioned, so clean seas. So originally, this is why I was approached, and we spoke about whether your club could get involved in beach cleans. So that's really what I'm going to focus on for the next few minutes. So as I say, when I'm talking about clean seas, this is all sorts of different pollutants, visible and otherwise. But we do tend to talk about plastic a lot because I guess because it's visible, it's an easy thing for folk to grasp. It tends to grab a lot of headlines, and it is a major problem. The photo that you can see here actually shows all of the litter that was found just on 100 metres of one beach during our Great British Beach Clean last year. And probably if you're looking at it, you can quite easily identify some of those things. There's an awful lot of cigarette butts, for example. The reason why our beach cleans are all a bit different is we don't just ask people to pick up the litter, we ask people to survey and write down what they find. And it's the data that makes the difference. That's how we really can influence change. So that's what I'm going to talk about. So I mentioned it once, but the Great British Beach Clean, this is kind of our flagship event for the Marine Conservation Society. Every year it takes place over a week in September. So the dates are on the slide now. So this is something I would encourage you, if you can jot it down, stick it in your phone or whatever. Really important date for your diary. If you can do a beach clean during that time, then that means you're contributing to a data set and a movement that is not just across the UK, but it's also global, which for me, I think is quite exciting, because sometimes when we're thinking about all of the problems in the seas, it's very easy to feel overwhelmed. And by actually taking part in this activity, you know that globally folk are pulling together. People just like us all around the world are cleaning beaches, surveying the litter they find, and it all helps to add to this long-term important data set so that we understand how marine litter is changing. Broadly, that does mean that we see marine litter is increasing. That's obviously important information that we can use when we're lobbying government, for example. But also we can see changes, we can see different types of marine litter emerging, or really positively, we can start to see where particular types of marine litter are actually decreasing because we've seen policy changes implemented. So it can work in lots of different ways. But ultimately, the most important thing here is that we are a science-founded organisation. Everything we do is based on science. And really, I think that's an important message, because that's why we need this litter data collected by volunteers. So I was actually asked this question just before I think lots of folk had arrived, but whether we'll be able to do the Great British Beach Clean this year, given all this COVID malarkey. We hope so, we certainly hope so. We are optimistic, as much as anyone can be in terms of making plans as far away as September. But just to say, we did manage to run the Great British Beach Clean last September, and that was with a fairly high level of lockdown. So this is me and my colleague Catherine. It was very different to what we considered normal. Normally the beach we were cleaning in Edinburgh that you can see there would probably have 100 volunteers, and it would be a big kind of noisy affair with, you know, a real kind of buzz about it. Due to lockdown rules, it was just the two of us. We were keeping 2 meters apart, using our litter pickers as a measure, and it just all took a lot longer. There were obviously various considerations about COVID and making sure we were safe. But it worked, and we were really thrilled that actually lots of volunteers got involved wherever they were around the UK. Obviously, only if they felt safe to do so. We certainly didn't encourage anyone to get involved in litter picking if they didn't want to. We don't want anyone to expose themselves to COVID risk if they're not comfortable. But just to highlight that, you know, even if we are back in some kind of a lockdown, it's horrible to even say it at this point, by September, we still anticipate we'll be able to go ahead in some shape or form. So this is what we ask folk to do. It's essentially a basic citizen science methodology, which I'm sure that you're familiar with from other projects potentially. And the reason for this methodology is these are the methods that have been established and agreed on are used globally. So it's 100 meters of the beach, from which you collect the litter. Just to keep it standardised, that's the reason for the length. You can just pace it out if you're confident of your pacing, or obviously if you've got tape measure, then great. Don't need anything snazzy, you know, just mark the ends with bags or coats or whatever. The only thing you need to do is make sure you're only surveying and collecting the litter between the strand line. So obviously that's the area where the seaweed tends to all get tangled up from the last time the tide was in, all the way to the back of the beach. And you just have to measure the width of the beach clean, because obviously that will vary depending on the beach, and just write that down on the form. And then it's just like any other beach clean. You work your way along with a friend or two, and someone's got the survey form, they're writing down what you're putting in the bag. It really is as easy as that. And of course, if you want to just carry on and do a beach clean elsewhere afterwards, that's absolutely fine. But for the survey, it's just that 100 metres. This is what the forms look like. They look a little bit kind of a bit overwhelming initially. There's a lot of information, but actually it's very, very logical. It's just organised by litter type, and then it's alphabetical, and you just do a wee tally system. I honestly don't think it adds much time to a normal beach clean. I've obviously done quite a lot of these now. I've been to lots of different areas of Scotland and done them. So I think I can be confident in saying it really is, it's pretty easy. And if needs be, you know, either local volunteer, you know, we've got some brilliant volunteers in Aberdeen who do these beach cleans a lot, potentially can help you on the weekend if you'd like, or we can obviously get arranged to have someone, a staff member, come across and help train you in advance if you'd like as well. But it would be really brilliant if as a club you could get involved, especially for some of those maybe harder to reach beaches that we've mentioned that you might need to access by boat. Obviously from a data perspective, the wider variety of beaches that are surveyed, the better, so that we don't just end up with beaches that are really easy to walk to, because that might give us an unrepresentative sample. So like I said, this is a global effort. It's called the International Coastal Cleanup, and it is really fantastic to be involved every year. And that's my mugshot, along with my colleagues Catherine and Callum in the middle there. And then I mentioned, you know, the whole point of this is that we want to influence policy so that we have less plastic and other pollutants entering the sea. And so this is how we use the data. So these are some examples, I guess, of where our influencing of government policy has been successful. So it was a while ago now, but the 5p carrier bag charge that was originally in Scotland and then has obviously been rolled out elsewhere and has gone up in some places in terms of the cost, originated from using the data that we were able to provide from volunteers, really showing the volume of plastic litter and specifically carrier bags on beaches. This is a nice one because the bag charge was brought in long enough ago that we can see the impact, the positive impact on the number of carrier bags that we do encounter on beaches. It has gone down markedly, I think about 30%. So that's definitely nice to be able to evidence that it works. You might remember in the last 5 years or so, we've had a ban on micro beads. These were these tiny plastic beads that were actually within things like face scrubs. The whole purpose of them was to help exfoliate, and then you could just rinse them away. And these plastic beads would go down the plug and out into the sea because they were too small to be captured in sewage treatment. So obviously these have now been banned, which is really positive. In Scotland, we have a ban on these plastic cotton bud sticks. We're hoping to see the sort of same bans occurring elsewhere in the UK. We have a big problem in Scotland that you might have witnessed yourself around wet wipes on our beaches. It's pretty disgusting. So if you've not seen these, or maybe you've not consciously clocked them, they look kind of grey, brown, and quite stretched and extended, like dirty cloth. Once they've been in through the sewage systems and arrive on our beaches, we seem to have a bigger problem with them in Scotland than in the rest of the UK. So we really are trying to encourage folk not to flush wet wipes down the toilet. But if folk insist that they need to flush them, they want to flush them, then we've worked with industry to bring about this certification, so this standard fine to flush. If you do use flushable wipes, then please look and check that they've got this standard on them, because if they do, that means that they should be able to degrade, or at least fall apart and fragment by the time they enter the sea. Another one recently for Scotland is the deposit return scheme. the return of the deposit return scheme. So some of you will remember we used to have this for Scotland. It's all about a small financial incentive to recycle bottles and other drinking containers. So we're hoping, it's all been delayed for the same reason that lots of things have been delayed in the last year, but we are hoping to see deposit return machines actually starting to pop up around Scotland from next year. And we know from all the countries where they have deposit return systems, there is a much lower rate of plastic bottles, especially appearing on beaches. So we really hope that'll have a positive impact. So that was just a bit of a kind of quick overview of kind of legislative impacts that we've been able to have using the data collected by volunteers. But this is what the data look like. So from the 2020 report. So you'll see here we've got quite a decent number, more than 2,000 volunteers took part, despite the fact it was COVID and it was more difficult than usual. And this is the sorts of litter that we're finding. Before I look at any particular litter type, just to highlight that actually all 5 of the kind of top most frequently encountered litter items on Scottish beaches are all plastic. So things like packets, obviously sweet packets, that kind of thing, all plastic. Cotton bud sticks, yes, we do have paper and cardboard alternatives. And yes, technically they're banned now, the plastic ones, but the trouble is there's still a lot in the system and we're still finding a lot of them on beaches. And string, of course, we can get natural fibre strings, but the majority of the ones that we do find, the vast majority, are plastic. So actually, just to give a bit of a snapshot, plastic is definitely the most frequently encountered litter type. But then focusing in just on that top offender. So as you can see, so on average on Scottish beaches, and of course this is averaging out a very remote beach, potentially somewhere on, thinking the Isle of, just to kind of help you to visualize this, think about kind of Barrow or somewhere like that with beautiful remote beaches that don't really look like they've got much litter, all the way to beaches around Aberdeen, which kind of might be more polluted, or around Edinburgh potentially. So on average, we've got 78 pieces of plastic or polystyrene for every 100 metres, which I think is pretty shocking. And in terms of what that looks like, so a lot of those are pieces of rigid plastic that have then fragmented. They've started to break up in the water, looking like this. Now, there's lots of information in this talk, but if there's one thing I would like you to take away from it and just remember, it's this: plastic never disappears. Okay, I think that's quite, maybe you know that already, maybe you don't. I think it's often misunderstood or overlooked. But at the moment, there's no way for plastic to simply disappear. We often use the wrong language around plastic all of the time. We talk about it breaking down, but only organic things can break down into their constituent parts. Plastics, they can just break up, they fragment. So a large piece of rigid plastic, like a plastic water bottle, will actually, just over time, it will fragment into smaller pieces of plastic, which will ultimately become microplastics. And in fact, material scientists estimate that something like a plastic bottle will take in the region of 1,000 years to fragment into microplastics. And by microplastics, what I mean is any piece of plastic that is equal to or smaller than 0.5 centimetre across. So that's quite alarming, and I think if you need a case or a rationale for why it's worth picking up a plastic bottle if you see that someone's dropped it, I think that should be it, because ultimately if we don't pick them up, then they'll remain in the environment forever and they'll just become more and more pieces of plastic. And as I say, it's just an inevitability. This is what happens to plastic when it's exposed to the motion of the sea and oxygen and UV rays, etc. So I briefly mentioned microplastics there, but this is what we actually mean, or this is what it looks like when we're talking about microplastics. So this is a slide from under a microscope, and what you can see, the kind of larger blue piece of plastic there is a fragment of plastic, like I just described. So it will have broken up from some larger piece of plastic. But lots of the other bits you can see, the kind of squiggly lines, are something we call microfibers. So what you can see here is fairly typical, which is that a huge proportion of the microplastics that we encounter if we look under a microscope. Maybe this is a sample from seawater, or it could be a sample from sand that's been sieved out. A large proportion will be microfibers, so these small plastic fibers. Now, these plastic fibers originate from various places, but we know that the fashion industry, the clothing that we're all wearing today, is probably a source of these microfibers. And in fact, I encourage you, if you're able to do so, to have a wee look at the label of whatever clothing you're wearing right now and just see what material it's made out of. Because it can be quite surprising, even materials that you maybe think are natural, even items of clothing that you think are made of natural fibers quite often have a blend. They might have elastin in them to make them more elasticated or something else. So quite often we'll find a combination of a natural and a synthetic fiber, and those plastic elements are being shed in our washing machines. So, in fact, we worked with Plymouth University. One of our volunteers, in fact, was a PhD student there, Dr. Imogen Napper, and she was looking at the rate of microfiber loss into the marine environment or from our washing machines. And as you can see here on this slide, 700 microfibers being released on average with every machine wash of our clothing. And obviously this varies depending on what your clothing's made out of, but this was an average measure. The trouble is, a lot of these microfibers are not able to be captured through sewage treatment and water treatment, and in fact they're ending up in the oceans because they're so small. So we're talking about things like polyester or nylon or acrylic, that kind of thing. And as you can see, this wee statistic here about the shrimp, unfortunately what we're finding is that microfibers especially are appearing in human food chains quite a bit if you eat seafood. So for example, you can see the shrimp statistic here. And in fact, we are finding that a huge proportion, so 35% of primary microplastics that are found in the environment originate from washing clothing. So that's quite a staggering statistic. And for this reason, we are asking if folk can help by taking this e-action. So please, if you feel like you'd like to see a change in this respect, please sign this petition. What we're asking is for our governments to actually introduce microfiber filters into all washing machines as standard. And in that way, we know there's evidence to say that a large proportion of the microfibers will be trapped before they can end up in the sea. So that's just a really simple and relatively quick action we would ask you to take. I just want to highlight another common offender of marine litter items that we find in Scotland, wet wipes and cotton bud sticks. I've mentioned this briefly, but just to show you pictures, this is what these litter items look like when you encounter them on beaches. So the thing I'm holding up, the kind of grey mass, is all wet wipes. I can't remember. I can't remember how many I counted that day, but they all kind of get tangled up together. It's pretty disgusting. And the reason they're called sewage-related debris is probably obvious, but it's just because people flush these things down the toilet, not realising that they are ultimately quite likely to end up in the sea, because our sewage systems just aren't designed to deal with receiving plastic. So as I say, good news in this respect, of course, we have got this ban for cotton bud sticks. We do hope that in the next few years we'll start to see a decline in the amount of plastic cotton bud sticks we find. We also do need this legislation to happen across the UK though, because of course ocean currents mean that cotton bud sticks could arrive here from lots of different places. As I say, we also work with industry on this wet wipe sort of standard. So again, please look out for that. So that's kind of hopefully tackling that sewage-related debris problem. And just to highlight, I mentioned before, but one of the interesting things about our beach cleans, it's 27 years of data that we have now. So obviously what we can see is trends, different types of litter appearing. And last year, unsurprisingly, we were seeing PPE for the first time, including lots of these single-use face masks. It's quite alarming, the volume of face masks that we are finding, as you can see on this slide. And I would expect that we'll probably continue to find those items, not just because people are still using them, but obviously, as I say, once they're in the environment, plastic doesn't disappear. It will just be floating around until we encounter it. So we partnered up with the Scottish Government, Keep Scotland Beautiful and Zero Waste Scotland, to encourage folk that if you're able to, if you feel safety, then do please use reusable face masks. It is just one way in which we can help. Obviously, these are not like medical standard face masks, and I certainly wouldn't advocate anyone compromising their health. But this is the advice, just kind of thinking about, are there single-use plastic items that maybe we don't need to use? At the very least, if you are using those plastic medical grade face masks, then of course we just need to make sure they're disposed of properly. But along that line of thinking about reducing the amount of plastic we use, this is a little initiative we have every year in the summertime. We ask people to take what we call the plastic challenge. And it's all about just encouraging all of us to think about using less single-use plastic if we possibly can. And that term single-use is important. Plastic it's a pretty amazing material. You know, it's allowed us to create and make a lot of things today that we couldn't have done previously. We're not advocating kind of an entire boycott of plastic. That would be ridiculous. But this is about plastics where actually, you know, maybe there is a good alternative. This is single use. We're particularly talking about something like a straw. It's pretty crazy that we're using something like a straw for just a few minutes when it's made of plastic, which will last forever. I'm sure this is an argument that you're all well aware of, but on this slide you can just see some examples of some of those easy swaps. And if anyone's interested in challenging yourselves, there are some brilliant plastic-free kind of communities and shops popping up all around Scotland. And on our website, we've got kind of a lot of really good advice for people who are thinking about how to use less plastic yourself. And to be honest, there's always more you can do. I certainly don't claim to have got this right myself. I think I've still got quite a few steps I would like to take. And I've just highlighted the jam jar and the fork there just to say this isn't all about buying stuff either. It could just be reusing or repurposing things you've already got at home. Okay, so I just wanted to think a wee bit about the scale of plastic pollution. So what you can see on this slide, this was, maybe some of you actually saw this yourself, but we partnered up with Sky a few years ago, and they created this amazing whale sculpture. It's made of all kinds of single-use plastics, lots of bottles and things like that. And the reason they did it was the whale represents the amount of plastic entering the sea every minute of every day. So it's quite shocking, really, when you witness the scale of this. I mean, it's the size of a humpback whale. It's the amount of litter going into the ocean all the time. And it was really quite powerful to travel around and to sort of be to see how people were reacting to seeing the whale, because a lot of people just genuinely had no idea about the volume of plastic going into the sea. In fact, it's estimated that 12.2 million tonnes of plastic enter the ocean globally every year. And this shocking picture, some of you're probably well aware of this, the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. So it's a collection of marine debris in the North Pacific Ocean. It's 3 times the size of France. It's caused by these oceanic gyres, kind of bringing all of these, swirling all these plastic floating items into one place. That's probably something you are aware of, but what you might not be so aware of is that the visible plastics, the visible plastic pollution here is really just the tip of the iceberg. Because if you look close up, firstly, there's an awful lot of microplastics that obviously are not visible on this view, but also oceanographers and ecologists have actually discovered that it's about 70% of marine plastic actually sinks to the bottom of the ocean or is actually floating in the water column. And maybe that's not a surprise to you as divers. Maybe this is something you've witnessed yourselves, but 70%, and that's quite incredible when you think about how much plastic we see on our coastlines or we actually see floating on the sea surface. That really is just the tip of the iceberg. So this is just a wee opportunity I wanted to kind of mention. I'm guessing you might well be aware of this project already, but I just wanted to plug it. So Sea Search is a long-term project that the Marine Conservation Society has been involved with running, working with divers like yourselves. I'm sure some of your members, I think, are Sea Search divers. And it's all about, it's not just divers, I should say, actually, snorkelers can get involved as well. That didn't used to be the case. So if you've ever been put off in the past because you thought, oh, well, actually, I'm not at the right level of diving or something, then it's still something you can do as a snorkeler even. So maybe you've got some friends who you might like to get involved. And really, this is for anybody who's interested in what you see in terms of marine life under the water and protecting it. So the main aims are to map out various types of seabed found in the near shore zone around Britain and Ireland. And we're also looking at recording what lives in those areas, establishing the richest sites for marine life. And it's really by using the data that sea search divers have collected that we're able to get things like marine protected areas in place, and also, very importantly, monitored, because there's absolutely no point in having a marine protected area if we're not monitoring how it's doing. So I'd really encourage you to get involved if you can. I just wanted to mention, whilst it's not the primary goal of sea search divers do also record marine litter, so I wouldn't be at all surprised if you've witnessed marine litter on your dives. But of course, this is the kind of thing on this slide is the kind of thing that are frequently encountered. And as you can see, a very large proportion of dives have encountered some form of marine litter, and it originates from all kinds of different places. I'm not going to go into the detail there, but I just thought it might be of interest to you. Okay. So what I'd like to just mention now briefly is ocean recovery, so another big strand of our work. And I should probably say that the lovely picture that you can see there is obviously just a kind of composite image, but it's something I show children quite a lot, just to highlight that all of this marine life is found in the seas around Scotland. Even, you won't be surprised to know, but even, of course, things like seahorses, there have been a few records, not so many. This is definitely tend to be warmer and more southern species. But children especially are really amazed to think that we've got such diversity, and this is really only a sample. So I briefly want to mention climate change very, very quickly, because it would be remiss of me not to, especially with COP26 in Glasgow this year. But of course, climate change is a major concern and a major area of work for us. And that's, of course, because climate change is having massive impacts on the sea. So whether that's rising sea levels, polar ice melt, sea temperatures rising, or ocean acidification. And I think one of the areas that we're particularly interested in is blue carbon. I'd be interested to know how many of you are familiar with that phrase. It's definitely not something that's well known more widely. Obviously, for you, you're obviously within this kind of marine community, so you might well be aware. But when we're talking about blue carbon, it's just the term for carbon that is captured and stored in the world's oceans and coastal ecosystems. So we're talking about whether it's kelp forests, like you can see in the picture, whether it's merle, it can be trapped in shells, for example, all kinds of different ways, but also seagrass and mangroves, huge variety of different marine habitats, really important. And the reason I put this slide up here is because so often, if you talk to most people about climate change, thankfully the messages are getting through. People are thinking, well, actually, it's all about trees, and trees are important, and they certainly are, especially tropical forests. But we really underestimate the role of the oceans, because tropical forests, whilst they're often described as the lungs of the planet, actually it's our oceans that provide about 70% of the oxygen we breathe. And of course, they have this huge role in locking up carbon. So just an example of a project we're working on in this area. You might be aware of this, the Dornoch Environment Enhancement Project. So this is up on the northeast of Scotland, around the Dornoch Firth, a partnership with Glenmorangie Distillery and also Heriot Watt University. And it's all about restoring native oysters to that important area of the sea. And in this photo, what you can see is they're actually putting scallop shells down, because the oysters need shells to be able to establish when their larvae are released into the environment. So it's a really interesting project, and it's all effectively about rewilding the ocean and bringing back that carbon storage role, as well as the fact that this is an important habitat where lots of things live. It's not just about carbon. So you might be interested to have a wee read about that project. And just to mention another project we're currently involved with, this is a more English focused project down in the south coast of England, but this is all about seagrass, a big partnership with all of these different partners. But just to say, seagrass is fascinating. It's a plant that lives under the water, so it's not an algae, it's not a seaweed. And because it's a plant, it has flowers, it has seeds. And in this photo, a diver is actually collecting the seeds of the seagrass, so they can actually be planted. And then those wee seedlings can be put back into the marine environment again to help to restore and regrow these seagrass habitats. Okay, just a very brief mention. Couple of other citizen science projects, and then I'll open it up for questions. So without even getting your wetsuit on and getting in the water or your dry suit, we've got a project called the Big Seaweed Search. It's really about rock pooling. It's a really great family activity, something you could do with family or friends who maybe aren't divers, or maybe you do it on a day you're not diving. But I can certainly help get anyone set up with that project if you're interested. I've put a link at the end of this talk and to be shared with you afterwards, so you can find the website. But just get in touch if you've got any questions and if you'd like to get involved. It's a really nice little project to get involved with. And the target seaweeds, the ones you'd be looking for in this project, are all selected because they're indicators of climate change or because they're invasive species. So they've got direct conservation links. And the other citizen science project I wanted to mention is the jellyfish survey. Really, really simple, something you can do just when you're out walking the dog even. But if you see lots of jellyfish, we do just have a map on our website, and we just ask people to click on the map where you were, maybe upload a photo if you weren't sure of the species, or tell us what species they were. And we're just mapping and tracking jellyfish sightings around the UK. Okay, very, very brief mention of sustainable seafood. So I just wanted to talk about this briefly, partly in the light of Seaspiracy, which I know has created waves, no pun intended, in the last few weeks. At Marine Conservation Society, we always emphasise that, like, anything that people are doing, any actions that folk are doing to help protect marine life, whether that's by choosing not to eat fish or choosing to eat fish but making sure you eat sustainable fish, you know, we respect all those decisions. The Good Fish Guide is something that our team of scientists are regularly updating. Every 6 months, in fact, we update the Good Fish Guide, which is available as an app. It's a really comprehensive resource so that if you eat seafood, you can look up whatever it is that you're interested in eating. And there's basically a traffic light system. If it's a red rated seafood species, then we would say, please avoid eating that one. That means it's unsustainable. If it's green rated, that is a good sustainable option. So please use that. Download the app if you would like to be able to make more informed seafood choices. Okay, and now just a very brief overview to remind you of all the different things I've mentioned, and then I'll be very happy to answer questions. So the first thing was, please do take part in our beach cleans. You can do that at any time of the year, but as I say, that week in September, the Great British Beach Cleans, particularly important. If you could sign that microfiber petition, that would be a great help. Maybe share it on your social media if you use social media. Take the plastic challenge. Again, that can be a bit of fun. You can maybe do it with friends or family. It can be a bit competitive. Think about if there's fewer single-use plastic items that you could use. Take part in citizen science. Oops, I've gone slightly off the slide there. But like I say, that's Sea Search, so that's the one for divers. Something as simple as the Jellyfish Watch. See a jellyfish, show us where it was on the map. Or the Big Seaweed Search, that was the one that was more about rock pooling. Using the Good Fish Guide if you want to make more informed seafood choices. And then if you're interested, especially in the run-up to the Scottish election, to really kind of understand our policy asks, what we're asking our government to do and our plans for policy change for the marine environment in the next 10 years, then there's a nice simple summary in that ocean recovery plan that you can see linked to there. Okay, so I'm going to switch my slides off so I can see you again. And I'm very happy to answer any questions you might have. Sorry, I'm just trying to, there we go. Hopefully I'll be able to see you in just a moment. Cool. Okay, can you see me again?
Yeah, you're good.
Perfect. Okay, so yeah, I'm very happy to answer any questions you might have. If people have been putting them in the chat, could I ask maybe if Dimitri could, yeah, maybe chair it slightly just so I know which questions we're going through.
I don't see any questions in the chat
okay.
at the moment.
That's fine.
just while people maybe start typing.